disturbing alleged incident, which Williams went. Jeffrey Epstein's ex-girlfriend speaking out tonight. Stacey Williams, a former Sports Illustrated model who dated Epstein in the early 90s, has spent time with both Epstein and Donald Trump together. In one disturbing alleged incident, which Williams went public with last year before the presidential election, Williams says Trump groped her in front of Epstein at Trump Tower in 1993. Here's what she told our Sunland Sarfati when she first broke her silence.
The second he was in front of me, he pulled me into him, and his hands were just on me and didn't come off. Then the hands started moving, and they were on the side of my breasts, on my hips, back down to my butt, back up, sort of then, just on me and didn't come off. Then the hands started moving, and they were on the side of my breasts, on my hips, back down to my butt, back up, sort of then, they were just on me the whole time. And I froze.
Williams also claimed that Epstein and Trump looked at each other and smiled during the alleged incident, which Williams says she now believes was coordinated and, quote, some kind of weird, twisted game. Trump denied Williams's allegations through his campaign at the time, which said in part, quote, it's obvious this fake story was contrived by Kamala Harris's campaign. And Stacey Williams is out front now to speak out for the first time since the uproar over Trump's handling of the Epstein case. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As you know, Epstein is dominating the news once again, and his relationship with Trump is under scrutiny. While you were dating Epstein, can you tell us how close these two men were?
They were best friends. I dated Jeffrey for a period of more or less, I think about 4 or 5 months. And the only friend that he would mention every time we saw each other or had a phone conversation was Donald. And he would share a lot of anecdotes. I have plenty of anecdotes. And yeah, they were very close, and they were up to no good.
And how did Epstein talk about Trump? Sort of what was the quality of those anecdotes and how he described him?
There was a time when he mentioned he had to check in on him because he was unwell and very upset about.
Stacey Williams, a former Sports Illustrated model who dated Epstein in the early 90s, has spent time with both Epstein and Donald Trump together. In one disturbing alleged incident, which Williams went public with last year before the presidential election, Williams says Trump groped her in front of Epstein at Trump Tower in 1993. Here's what she told our Sunland Sarfati when she first broke her silence.
The second he was in front of me, he pulled me into him, and his hands were just on me and didn't come off. Then the hands started moving, and they were on the side of my breasts, on my hips, back down to my butt, back up, sort of then, they were just on me the whole time. And I froze.
Williams also claimed that Epstein and Trump looked at each other and smiled during the alleged incident, which Williams says she now believes was coordinated and, quote, some kind of weird, twisted game. Trump denied Williams's allegations through his campaign at the time, which said in part, quote, it's obvious this fake story was contrived by Kamala Harris's campaign. And Stacey Williams is out front now to speak out for the first time since the uproar over Trump's handling of the Epstein case. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As you know, Epstein is dominating the news once again, and his relationship with Trump is under scrutiny. While you were dating Epstein, can you tell us how close these two men were?
They were best friends. I dated Jeffrey for a period of more or less, I think about 4 or 5 months. And the only friend that he would mention every time we saw each other or had a phone conversation was Donald. And he would share a lot of anecdotes. I have plenty of anecdotes. And yeah, they were very close, and they were up to no good.
And how did Epstein talk about Trump? Sort of what was the quality of those anecdotes and how he described him?
There was a time when he mentioned he had to check in on him because he was unwell and very upset about something that had happened. I remember because he was late to pick me up, and he was explaining why he was late. They were just, it was such a long time ago, but it was just that was his bro, that was his wingman. It was clearly, I'd hear about Ghislaine and I'd hear about Jeffrey, and I met Ghislaine. Bro, that was his wingman. It was clearly, I'd hear about Ghislaine and I'd hear about Jeffrey. And I met Ghislaine in his house. She would come wafting in and out, the home in New York. So he was clearly just someone that he talked about all the time. And again, I met Jeffrey the second time, and we started dating based on the reintroduction that happened at the Plaza Hotel at a Christmas party in 1992 that Donald Trump threw. And they were very, very close.
So let's talk about this incident, alleged incident in 1993, where you say that Trump groped you in front of Epstein. I do want to note that CNN has spoken to 3 friends of yours who confirmed that you told them about this alleged incident over past decades. Can you tell me more about what happened that day, and particularly how Trump and Epstein interacted?
Yeah, before I get into the details of what happened, which, obviously I told you guys and I've shared with multiple outlets the specifics of the assault that happened, I want to point out that I was polygraphed before I did all this by one of the most renowned examiners in the world. Michael Wolff has hundreds of hours of interviews with Jeffrey Epstein where Jeffrey confirmed to Michael what the two of them did to me long before I came out and told you all of this. So those are two critical data points that you need to have, and now I'll walk you through what happened. I was dating Jeffrey. He was always talking about Donald. It was his bestie and everything, and he was joking about how Donald thought I was hot, and Donald thinks I'm this or whatever, wants to talk to you. And he was telling me this as we were taking a walk down Fifth Avenue one day, and he said, let's stop in and see him at his offices. So we went up to his office in Trump Tower, and within a couple of minutes, Donald was outside of his door, and his hands were all over me. They were on my breasts, they were on my butt, they were on my hips, up and down, while the two of them just kept having a normal conversation. I don't remember exactly what was in the conversation. Again, this was, we're talking 90, this is 93 now. It was something about, it was irrelevant. It was like, oh, Stacey's career's on fire. She just did Sports Illustrated again, blah, 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 blah. And they were back and forth, smiling and grinning and carrying on a conversation while Donald ran his hands all over me. And, when that happens in broad daylight in someone's office and an assistant's walking back and forth, you're in shock. If it happens in a dark alleyway, right, you defend yourself. But when it's hidden in its brazenness like that, which is Donald Trump's forte, you go into shock. So I froze, and it was over very quickly. It was a few minutes, and then we got back in the elevator, and Jeffrey's energy had changed. He was like seething. He was enraged. He would make eye contact with me, and then we got out on the street on Fifth Avenue, and he looked at me and he just started yelling at me, saying, "Why did you let him do that?" And he was so enraged. And then I remember thinking, like, why did I? I felt like I was coming back into my body at that moment, and I was confused.
Guess what? If you live in the UK and are older than 55, you could get up to £10,000 to help.
At that moment, and I was confused. Yelling at me, saying, "Why did you let him do that?" And he was so enraged. And then I remember thinking, like, why did I? I felt like I was coming back into my body at that moment, and I was confused. So that's the story of the assault.
And I do just want to note, Stacey, that Trump has denied these allegations, which you are well aware of. And I know at times you've referenced videos, which we have not confirmed the existence of. But I know that you felt that this was coordinated later when you look back on it. What was it that made you draw that conclusion?
Well, I was sort of known in the industry for being somewhat combative with, photographers who would expose themselves or do inappropriate things, or even guys who would touch or harass on the streets. And Jeffrey was aware of that. And I think he was excited. I think the gist in my mind, given what he knew and the way it played out, was, hey, I'm going to deliver this person to you who's actually not going to let you get away with what you do. And I did, because I froze. Like I said, when it's hidden in its brazenness like that, you freeze. And, he's a master of that. So, he talked about it, right? He talked about pussy grabbing on the Access Hollywood tape.
And tonight, if you're aware, President Trump has filed this libel lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal over its reporting that there was this note bearing Trump's name as a signature in an outline of a naked woman that was included in a 50th birthday album for Epstein in 2003, a note that also depicted an imaginary conversation between the two men. And part of it reads, quote, Donald saying, "We have certain things in common, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, yes, we do. Come to think of it, Donald, enigmas never age. Have you noticed that? Jeffrey, as a matter of fact, it was clear to me that the last time I saw you." And then finally, Donald, "A pal is a wonderful thing. Happy birthday, and may every day be another wonderful secret." Trump called that letter fake. He said it was out of character for him because he never wrote a picture or drew a picture in his life. Wrote a picture, I think he said.
No,
it's not his kind of language. Basically, fake. He said it was out of character for him because he never wrote a picture or drew a picture in his life. Wrote a picture, I think he said.
No,
it's not his kind of language. Based on your time with both men, does that sound out of character to you?
What, are you kidding me? I know what they were up to together. It happened to me. I was polygraphed. I have the post-assault postcard with a love note. So I have the receipts. Where are Donald Trump's receipts? Where are they? I know what they're up together, and I know what that means. It's very clear. It wasn't baking or fishing.
Well, Stacey Williams, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Missing in much of the MAGA frenzy over the Jeffrey Epstein. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Missing in much of the MAGA frenzy over the Jeffrey Epstein files are the voices of survivors of the sexual abuse he perpetrated against them. Many, like our next guest, have joined the call for transparency and for the Trump administration to release the files as promised. This comes as Virginia Giuffre, an outspoken survivor of sex trafficking by Jeffrey Epstein, died apparently by suicide at age 41 in April. She was the first survivor to come out publicly against Epstein and his co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, who remains in prison. She also sued Prince Andrew for sexually assaulting her when she was 17. The disgraced prince was forced to step away from his royal duties and settled with Giuffre in 2022. Her family said in a statement, quote, Virginia was a fierce warrior in the fight against sexual abuse and sex trafficking. She was the light that lifted so many survivors, unquote. Just last week, when the FBI and Department of Justice announced there was, quote, no incriminating client list, it also said Epstein harmed over 1,000 victims over 2 decades, far more than previously known. For more, we're joined by Teresa Helm, who is a survivor of sexual abuse by Jeffrey Epstein, facilitated by Ghislaine Maxwell. She was assaulted by Epstein in the early 2000s. She now works as the Survivor Services Coordinator for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Her 2024 piece for Newsweek is headlined, I'm a Jeffrey Epstein Survivor. The documents are an opportunity. Thank you so much for joining us. You, Teresa Helm, have talked about the dangers of grooming. As you see all of this taking place, the uprising within the MAGA movement, lost are what sexual violence survivors go through. Talk about how you first met Jeffrey Epstein, how you were brought to him, how you were groomed.
Well, hello, good morning. I can certainly talk to that. So I was attending college out in California at the time and was a full-time student and a full-time employee there. And so that began the process of recruitment to grooming, passed along the line from various people as far as this is an opportunity that I'd like for you to see if you're interested in and go talk to this person. So after speaking with a couple young women about an opportunity that I thought I was being blessed with at the time, I eventually met with Ghislaine Maxwell, who really, what she did was pretty astounding in the fact that within a day, I was convinced that I was in a safe, healthy, wonderful environment, blessed with an opportunity to pursue a career that I had only dreamed of having. In fact, that was my dream, to do what she had stated I would do alongside her, working for her. She was very polite and kind. She built trust in a very, within hours, I thought that I had really landed the opportunity of a lifetime. My family was very pleased that I was there interviewing with her, which is what the intention, that's what I thought I was there for, was an interview. And things went so amazingly well. And then she was so successful in all of that, very, I would call it, master manipulation. She was very calculated in her craft and did it very well. I was very young. I mean, I was an adult, 22 years old. However, I had such big dreams and aspirations and determination, and really wanted to make the most of this opportunity that I thought that I was getting, to the point where at the end of my time with Ghislaine Maxwell, although I hadn't known that there was a partner, as she referred to him, that I would be meeting at the end of my time with her. I hadn't heard Jeffrey or any other person's name the entire time, from beginning sitting behind the desk at work in California at the college, to meeting Sarah Cullen at the beach, to who then introduced me to Ghislaine. I had no idea that there was a final person that I was going to go meet. And once I learned of him by the name of Jeffrey, I did not... I paused and thought about some things, waved any kind of red flag in my mind, because again, she was Ghislaine was so good at what she had done and built that trust in me. And so then I walked myself to Jeffrey's home later that day to what I thought was to interview with him, without really a lot of question, actually being quite excited, because I thought, well, if I was so successful here with Ghislaine, which has really made me believe that I have been, now I get the opportunity to go complete this, like a second round of the interview. And that was really, I walked myself into tragedy. I had no idea. I actually should, and I will reframe that. I didn't walk myself into tragedy. I was lured there. I was coaxed there, coerced there, under false and fraudulent, conditions and expectations.
And it was then that Jeffrey Epstein assaulted you? That's
right. There in his very big, beautiful home there in Manhattan. The home that Ghislaine was raving about after I had been complimenting her on her home and speaking about the different various buildings and the architecture and how much I enjoyed it, and comparing different cities to New York. And then she raved about his. If I thought hers was great, wait till I see his. Yeah, so it was there. Mm-hmm.
So you have joined the call for the Epstein files to be released. Can you explain why you feel this is so important?
Where I stand with all of this is in, utter solidarity with survivors of this entire nightmare that's just been ongoing for decades, with these people that have gotten away with so much for so long, whether it was a failure of the system back in the 90s, whether failure of the system again in the early 2000s, There are so many women, and at the time, even, children that have been harmed by these people. I really urge everyone to focus the commitment, the attention, all this time, effort, and energy onto bringing to light what needs to bring to light for these survivors and their healing, and less about political weaponization of anything, because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people's lives, and it should not be weaponized either way in any administration, no matter who's in control at the time, who did what when, who's doing what now. Transparency is key, because we cannot move forward as a society and as a culture without these fundamental changes of doing the right thing and holding people accountable, because we can't continue to have systems of power that just get away, or people, whether it's a system or a person. We cannot continue to have these people or systems continue to get away with anything that they can get away with, because they're skating through, they're dodging accountability. There's too much money involved. So, people silence through money. We have got to change that. It's degrading our society to continue to allow these predators and perpetrators to get away with harming so many people. Those that harm and exploit, they have to be silenced, not the survivors continuing to be silenced. Because when you don't have accountability, you don't have justice. We are so far out of balance with justice. It's almost like, Lady Liberty, she can take a small step to the ground, because we're so uneven, where survivors are holding on, clinging on to the hope, which tends to be, one thing that you can't take away from a survivor. It's how we get here. We survive through it because we have so much hope. But hope tends to get shattered often. And it's like the onus is on us to pick up the pieces and try to get louder and louder. Our silence is very loud within us. We have to then, we're tasked with rising back up, fighting bigger, fighting louder, screaming from the mountaintops, like, who is going to do something? Because we are setting horrible, horrible influences to our children and to our youth of what you can't get away with, depending on who you are, what position you are in. And as I said, I just feel like oftentimes we have these huge profile cases where people are harming others, and there's just such a big, did this really happen to you? Well, if it did, what about that? We have to get to the point where we are survivor focused in the justice system, because we're such a huge part of it that we have to stop politicizing everything and listen to the survivors, listen to the ones that have the lived experience. You cannot take this experience. People can say there's nothing there. You cannot take the lived experience away from us. Not that we wanted it in the first place, but here it is. It lives with us. It remains with us. We're fighting for justice. You cannot take away our lived experience.
Well, Teresa Helm, I want to thank you so much for being with us. We're going to link to your piece, I'm a Jeffrey Epstein Survivor. The documents are an opportunity. Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.
So who are the biggest names in the newly released Jeffrey Epstein documents? We're going to get you caught up to speed on what you need to know about some of these very high-profile people. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So it's been a few days since the release of a trove of documents in the Jeffrey Epstein saga. And by the way, we expect a lot more documents to be released. We believe 191 out of 250 documents have been released so far. A lot of material. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to go over some of the bigger names, the top names in these documents for you. You don't have to read over 900 pages of materials. We're going to break down what you need to know about some of these bigger, high-profile names. But I want to give you a little bit more context about what we're talking about. So this is all coming from when a New York judge named Loretta Prescott, she ordered the release of all of these documents since they're part of court filings in a defamation case, a civil case, that was filed by alleged Jeffrey Epstein victim Virginia Giuffre against Epstein accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell back in the day.
You don't need an expensive solicitor to write your will. Protect your loved ones and assets with a professionally written and legally binding will for just £19.99. If you don't have a will when the worst sadly happens, the government will have complete control over your assets, while your family and loved ones have to apply to the courts to regain any control. And without a will, your home, money, and assets will end up going where the law wants them to, instead of how you'd wish them to be passed on. The good news is, it's quick.
Against Epstein accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell back in the day. Now, Epstein, of course, was the financier who died in his jail cell awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. He died from a suicide. This also comes after he pled guilty 10 years earlier to state charges of soliciting and procuring a minor for prostitution. This was a very controversial deal because it saw Jeffrey Epstein avoid prosecution on even more severe federal charges. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail, but spent most of that time in a work release program where he'd be at his office outside of the jail during the day and only have to go back to his jail cell at night. As for Ghislaine Maxwell, she was arrested, charged, and she was convicted of sex trafficking counts in 2021, sentenced to 20 years behind bars. Now, Virginia Giuffre, she used to be known as Virginia Roberts before she got married, she filed a defamation lawsuit against Maxwell in 2015. And this case was settled, but media outlets wanted to see all of these court filings, particularly the Miami Herald. And the reason Judge Preska ordered these documents to be unsealed and the identities of numerous John and Jane Does to be revealed is because much of this is already known. Much of this has already been disclosed to the public through court filings, interviews, photographs, but we are getting a little bit more context. There seems to be a little bit more of a spotlight put on these connections, put on these associations, some of it being tied together in a different way. We're learning some interesting details. But before I get into this, when I talk about the top names, I mean the names in here that are of actual significance to the Epstein-Maxwell saga. That's not to downplay the rest of the filings, but to be clear, it's not just about famous people. Because you have names in these documents like Michael Jackson, Bruce Willis, Cameron Diaz, Leonardo DiCaprio, but they are only mentioned in quick references. Like an alleged victim of Epstein said that Epstein would often name drop these kind of people, saying he had just been on the phone with that celebrity or this celebrity. I say this because I want to be very clear, and I know I say this all the time, but not everyone named in these documents is accused or guilty of some nefarious or criminal activity, okay? These could be former employees, victims, associates, or even just people mentioned in passing during deposition testimony. This is not the Epstein list of everyone who participated in his alleged sex trafficking ring on Epstein's Island, okay? I want to make that clear. By the way, who I'm talking about are the big names that have been mentioned in the documents and have more than a fleeting association or connection to Epstein and provide an interesting tidbit in a way. Okay, now with that, let's start with former President Bill Clinton, okay? He hasn't been accused of any wrongdoing, but his name appears multiple times in these filings, association or connection to Epstein, and provide an interesting tidbit in a way. Okay, now with that, let's start with former President Bill Clinton, okay? He hasn't been accused of any wrongdoing, but his name appears multiple times in these filings. So Clinton has always maintained that while he was associated with Epstein in the 1990s and early 2000s and flew on Epstein's jet for philanthropic work for the Clinton Foundation, he cut ties with him. Clinton's representatives say the former president never visited Little St. James Island, Epstein's Island. Clinton's team said that he didn't know about Epstein's, quote, terrible crimes. And more recently, a Clinton spokesperson told CNN that it is, quote, been nearly 20 years since President Clinton last had contact with Epstein. But as I said, he's mentioned in these documents. So one of the alleged victims of Epstein, Johanna Schoberg, explained in a deposition that she knew Clinton had dealings with Epstein. And according to her, Epstein said at one point, quote, Clinton liked them young, referring to young girls. But it is important to note that Schoberg never met the former president, never saw him in Epstein's Little St. James Island. Again, this is something that Epstein had allegedly told her, so take that with a grain of salt. There was something new in the documents that I know for me, I had never heard before, thought it was really interesting. So Virginia Giuffre claimed that former President Bill Clinton stormed into the offices of Vanity Fair and said that the magazine couldn't publish a story about Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah, the claim was made in a May 2011 email concerning an interview to promote a book that she was writing. She said Clinton, quote, walked into VF, Vanity Fair, and threatened them not to write sex trafficking articles about his good friend J.E., meaning Jeffrey Epstein. Well, former Vanity Fair editor-in-chief Graydon Carter absolutely denied this, telling the Telegraph publication, quote, this categorically did not happen. In fact, former Vanity Fair writer Vicky Ward went on CNN and tried to set the record straight, saying that it was Epstein, not Clinton, who tried to block a Vanity Fair story.
I never heard that that happened. What I wonder is if Virginia Roberts is hearing gossip and getting it slightly wrong, because what did happen back in 2002, when I was profiled to write about Jeffrey Epstein, I did hear about the story of two sisters, Maria and Annie Farmer, and they were on the record detailing to me at the time the abuse they had suffered at the hands of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. When Jeffrey Epstein realized that I was in possession of their allegations, he appeared in the offices of Vanity Fair. I knew about this because the fact checker who was fact checking my piece at the time sent me an email saying, oh my God, he's standing here in the office. And, you know, I've said before, you know, the Farmer sisters' allegations were suddenly cut from the piece that was ultimately published.
Now, aside from all of that, there were other mentions of former President Bill Clinton in these documents as well, and they really came up in reference to whether Giuffre's lawyers would be allowed to depose him in the defamation lawsuit. The documents say that Bill Clinton would be a, quote, key person who can provide information about his close relationship with defendant and Mr. Epstein and disapprove Miss Maxwell's claims. The judge ultimately denied that request. But there was another reference to Bill Clinton, too. And talking about litigation, Maxwell wasn't too happy about this lawsuit because back in January 10th, 2015, when she emailed her press agent after he had called Giuffre a liar, she wrote, quote, I have already suffered such a terrible and painful loss over the last few days that I can't even see what life after Press Hill even looks like. Statements that don't address all just lead to more questions. What is my relationship to Clinton? Andrew, on and on. Let's rest till Monday. I need headspace. Andrew, of course, referencing Prince Andrew. Now, adding on to that, there's something else I want to mention as we talk about all of these documents. So when Giuffre first went public with her claims against Maxwell and Epstein that she was forced into the sex crimes ring, and Maxwell was weighing her options on how to respond to all this, Jeffrey Epstein emailed Ghislaine Maxwell saying, quote, ask press to investigate whether Clinton was ever there. Challenge the press. Well, interesting tidbit. Now, one of the things in these filings I want to talk about as well in this document dump was a Maxwell court filing where she disclosed the identities of people that may have information to help her legal case. One of those people was Louis Freeh, the former head of the FBI from 1993 to June 2001. This was during President Clinton's presidential term. And it says Mr. Free, quote, may have knowledge concerning travel of Bill Clinton. Probably Maxwell wanted to show that Clinton never visited Epstein's island, that he was only on Epstein's plane with Secret Service. In another filing, Laura Menninger, Maxwell's attorney, stated in a declaration that Clinton wasn't on the island based on a report from Louis Freeh. And Menninger emphasized how if he was on the island, the Secret Service would have had all this information, including flight logs showing that he did. So Menninger called the move to question Clinton in a deposition, quote, utter nonsense and a, quote, transparent ploy to increase media exposure for her sensational stories through deposition sideshow. I want to take a minute to talk about something that happens all the time. Workplace injuries. If you get hurt at your job, slip and fall, mechanical failures, negligence, that is a heavyweight in the industry and that wins over 100,000 cases. Phone and calling them at 833-6.
Standards. At William Hill Vegas.
We have prominent lawyer and retired Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz to talk about. So Dershowitz has been mentioned before in connection with Giuffre and Epstein. Dershowitz also helped negotiate that non-prosecution agreement that I mentioned back in 2008 for Epstein. But then you fast forward to 2022 and Ms. Giuffre withdrew an allegation that she had made against Dershowitz. She issued a statement saying, quote, I long believed that I was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein to Alan Dershowitz. However, I was very young at the time. It was a very stressful and traumatic environment. And Mr. Dershowitz has from the beginning consistently denied these allegations. I now recognize I may have made a mistake in identifying Mr. Dershowitz. But back to these documents at hand, it doesn't end there. Because a person only identified as Jane Doe number 3, who was a minor, says that she was forced to have sex with Dershowitz in Florida, New York, New Mexico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and on private planes. Documents also claim that says that she was forced to have sex with Dershowitz in Florida, New York, New Mexico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and on private planes. Documents also claim that Dershowitz was an eyewitness to other sexual abuse as well. There was the testimony of 2 housekeepers of Epstein. They testified that Dershowitz came pretty often to Epstein's Florida mansion and got massages while he was there. And one of these employees said that Dershowitz was present alone at the home of Epstein without his family in the presence of young girls. But I should mention that in another document, Ms. Sjoberg, again, Jeffrey Epstein's accuser, denied having sex with Alan Dershowitz in a limousine with Giuffre and Epstein in the car. According to the documents, too, Epstein and his alleged co-conspirators previously pled the Fifth before answering questions about Alan Dershowitz. Now, Dershowitz's name in these documents is not a real shocker. I mentioned the prior Giuffre allegations, but also flight logs that had been disclosed publicly listed Dershowitz flew on Epstein's plane. And Dershowitz himself admitted that he once received a massage at Epstein's home, but claimed he kept his pants on and that it was carried out by a middle-aged woman named Olga. And Dershowitz admitted that he was on the island. He said, quote, once my wife, my daughter, and I were on vacation in the Caribbean, and he had just bought the island, meaning Epstein. He asked us to come and say hello. No young people on the island, no Lolita Express or anything. That's the nickname for Epstein's plane, by the way. But to be clear, Dershowitz has always denied all accusations of wrongdoing. He actually was pushing for the release of all these documents for purposes of transparency and to clear his name. And this past week, he released a defense online.
Of course I'm on the list. I was his lawyer. I flew on his plane with other lawyers several times for legal meetings in Florida and other proceedings. I was his lawyer. So many questionable and illegal activities.
That was a 31-minute response, by the way. We just took a snippet of it. All right, moving on to another big name that you know has already been swept up in the Epstein scandal, Prince Andrew, Duke of York. So Virginia Giuffre has accused him of being one of the people that she had sex with as a minor. Now, he settled a lawsuit with her out of court for reportedly millions of dollars, but he continues to deny any wrongdoing. In fact, his attorney said in a court filing, quote, Prince Andrew regrets his association with Epstein and commends the bravery of Miss Giuffre and other survivors in standing up for themselves and others. Now, talking about these documents, I mentioned that email from Maxwell before where she references Prince Andrew, but there is more in these new documents. So Miss Sjoberg says that Prince Andrew groped her breast while they were taking a photo in Epstein's Manhattan apartment in 2001, and this involved, of all things, a puppet. Yes. So Miss Sjoberg explained, quote, at one point, Ghislaine told me to come upstairs, and we went into a closet and pulled out the puppet, the caricature of Prince Andrew, and brought it down. And there was a little tag on the puppet that said Prince Andrew on it, and that's when I knew who he was. It looked like him, and she brought it down and presented it to him, and that was a great joke because apparently it was a production from a show on BBC, and they decided to take a picture with it in which Virginia and Andrew sat on a couch. They put the puppet on Virginia's lap, and I sat on Andrew's lap, and they put the puppet's hand on Virginia's breast, and Andrew put his hand on my breast, and they took a photo. Pretty wild stuff right there to think about. But in another document, there is an unidentified accuser, Jane Doe number 3, who I mentioned before. She claims that she was instructed to sleep with Prince Andrew during an orgy on Epstein's island. In fact, she was told to give him anything that he demanded. This court filing from 2014 alleges that she was forced to have sex with the prince when she was Andrew during an orgy on Epstein's island. In fact, she was told to give him anything that he demanded. This court filing from 2014 alleges that she was forced to have sex with the prince when she was just a minor, by the way, in at least 3 places. Not only Little St. James Island, Epstein's island, but also in Maxwell's apartment in London and in New York. Now, this Jane Doe 3 was then instructed to report back to Jeffrey Epstein about what happened. Talking of Prince Andrew, though, let's also highlight the transcript of the deposition of T1 Alessi. This is a manager of Epstein's Florida house. This was in the released documents, by the way, and he explained, quote, many celebrities, including Prince Andrew and Andrew's ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, were at Epstein's home. In fact, he said the prince spent weeks with us, sleeping in the main guest bedroom and getting daily massages. Ferguson, by the way, has not been accused of any wrongdoing. All right, let's talk about Jean-Luc Brunel. He's the French modeling agent who killed himself in a Paris jail in 2022 awaiting trial on rape charges. He's been cited as a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, he was accused of providing Epstein's sex trafficking ring with young girls as young as 12 and also sexually abusing minors as well. Brunel denied the accusations. Going back to the filings, in her deposition, Giuffre claimed that she was ordered by Maxwell to have sex with Brunel at many places. One of the documents, it says that Epstein forced Jane Doe 3 to be trafficked by Brunel. It goes on to say Epstein forced Jane Doe 3 to observe him, Brunel, and Maxwell engage in illegal sexual acts with dozens of underage girls. Epstein also forced Jane Doe 3 to have sex with Brunel on numerous occasions at places including Epstein's mansion in West Palm Beach, Little St. James Island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, New York City, New Mexico, Paris, the south of France, and California. Now, the documents also allege that Mr. Brunel would offer girls from poor countries modeling jobs as a way to lure them into all this. In fact, in another document, accuser Nadia Marcinkova is asked in a deposition about 12-year-olds being sent to Jeffrey Epstein to be sexually abused. And if, quote, these 3 12-year-olds were from France, were they sent to him on his birthday by Jean-Luc Brunel or by somebody else? Marcinkova ended up invoking the Fifth Amendment to that question. Also, I should tell you that a new lawsuit has been filed out in Los Angeles in the last few days accusing Brunel of holding a woman hostage at a Canadian estate. The accuser, who's using the pseudonym Jessica Kramer, says that she was working as a model in New York when she was 18 years old, and she says Brunel and some of his employees drove her across the border into Canada, held her captive at a home there for several days. Plaintiff also claims that Brunel assaulted her at various locations, including Los Angeles. She says Brunel sought out models and young girls promising modeling jobs, but instead drugged and sexually assaulted them. This is a name you might have heard of connected to Jeffrey Epstein, but was also mentioned in these documents. Les Wexner. Now, the name might not be easily recognizable to a lot of you out there, but you certainly know his companies. This is a billionaire who owns Bath & Body Works, Abercrombie & Fitch, and possibly, most notably, Victoria's Secret. Wexner hired Jeffrey Epstein to be his personal financial manager in the 1980s, had a close relationship with him. In fact, in 1991, Wexner granted Epstein power of attorney over his affairs, and he also made Epstein a trustee for the board of the Wexner Foundation. There were accusations in the 90s that Epstein was using his connection to Wexner to pose as a Victoria's Secret recruiter. But in 2006, after Epstein was charged with multiple counts of molestation and unlawful sexual activity with a minor that ended in that 2008 plea deal I mentioned, the New York Times reported that Wexner didn't break ties with Epstein until 18 months later, and that the Oregon Attorney General was investigating whether Victoria's Secret had helped Epstein's legal team back in 2006, even digging up information on one of Epstein's accusers.
So, in terms of salary, you were thinking...
With Indeed, set salary expectations from the start.
But then in 2019, after Epstein was locked up for the second time, Wexner wrote a letter to the Wexner Foundation saying his former financial advisor had actually misappropriated huge sums of money from his family. Wexner said in an email to employees in 2019 that he regretted he ever crossed paths with Epstein. Quote, Mr. Epstein was my personal money manager. He was involved in many aspects of my financial life, but let me assure you that I was never aware of the illegal activity charged in the indictment. Now on to the documents. So his name, Les Wexner, comes up in one deposition of Maxwell where she's asked whether she provided a woman with an outfit of a sexual nature to wear for Mr. Wexner. Maxwell responded, categorically no. You did get that. I said categorically no. Interestingly, the document dump also revealed dozens of pages of handwritten phone messages from Jeffrey Epstein's staff, and it showed that there were many calls from Wexner or his office. There was also a note saying that Wexner's wife, Abigail, had called and wanted to talk about, quote, something private. Interesting to think about. All right, moving on to magician David Copperfield. Did you know about him in these document dumps? Yeah, he's a very high profile and wanted to talk about, quote, something private. Interesting to think about. All right, moving on to magician David Copperfield. Did you know about him in these document dumps? Yeah, he's a very high profile name mentioned in these filings. So Copperfield was actually previously subpoenaed in a litigation connected to Epstein, never was deposed. There was an allegation that Copperfield had visited Epstein in the past, had an association with him. But back to Epstein accuser Johanna Schoberg, who I've mentioned a lot so far, she testified that she met David Copperfield at a dinner at one of Epstein's homes. And she says Copperfield performed some magic tricks before asking if she, Schoberg, was aware that, quote, girls were getting paid to find other girls. She says he didn't really go into any further detail, including whether the girls were underage. Strange comment, right? But what is interesting about that, and maybe more importantly, and I've said this before, is that Epstein and Maxwell were accused of doing that. They were accused of using their victims as recruiters to find more girls to abuse. That's a really interesting comment to make, or allegedly make, right? So we don't know if it was actually made. But Schoberg testified that there was a girl at that house during that dinner that, quote, seemed young, could have been in high school. Now, Copperfield is also referenced in the deposition of one of Epstein's former employees, Sarah Kellen. She's asked about Epstein's relationship with Copperfield and whether he was part of the sex trafficking ring, namely, would Copperfield provide Epstein tickets to his magic shows, his illusionist shows, to be given out to young women. The idea there would be that you maybe take them backstage, you invite them backstage, you get the rest. Well, Kellen asserted her Fifth Amendment right not to self-incriminate herself, and she didn't answer the question. All right, now let's talk about late New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, because he's also listed in the documents. So Virginia Giuffre named Richardson as one of the people that she gave a massage to, but said she couldn't remember when Ghislaine Maxwell instructed her to do this. She did recall that she was sent to New Mexico, though. Now, Ms. Schoberg explained in a deposition that she believed Maxwell went to dinner with Richardson when Schoberg was visiting a ranch in New Mexico. Richardson died in September of last year, but he denied all of the claims. He was also listed on that filing that I mentioned from Ghislaine Maxwell as someone who may have information concerning Virginia Giuffre's, quote, false claims. In other words, Maxwell had hoped that he would be someone to help her legal case against Giuffre. Now, a name you likely don't know, Glenn Dubin, very important character in this. So he is a billionaire hedge fund manager here in the United States. He had a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, it's been reported that Epstein invested in his firm. But Dubin's wife, Dr. Eva Anderson Dubin, actually dated Jeffrey Epstein in the 80s and 90s before marrying Dubin. But here's where things take kind of a controversial turn. So after Epstein pled guilty in 2008 to soliciting and procuring prostitution of a minor, this couple allegedly came to his aid. They invited him for Thanksgiving dinner. Anderson Dubin even told Epstein's probation officer that she was, quote, 100% comfortable with Jeffrey Epstein around my children. Now, according to Giuffre in these documents, Glenn Dubin was the first person she was forced to have sex with after she completed her training as a masseuse and started working with Epstein. In a deposition, Giuffre testified, quote, when they say massage, that means erotic, okay? That's their term for it. And I'm telling you that Ghislaine told me to go to Glenn Dubin and give him a massage, which means sex. In another document, a deposition from 2016, one of Dubin's former employees, Ronaldo Rizzo, claimed that Epstein and Maxwell visited the Dubins once in 2005, and they brought along a 15-year-old Swedish girl who is, quote, shaking uncontrollably. According to Rizzo, the girl said that she was pressured to have sex. But before he could get more information, Miss Anderson Dubin walked into the room. Now, the Dubins have previously denied all allegations of wrongdoing or knowledge of Epstein's activity. Now, those were some of the biggest names that have actual real connections to Epstein and Maxwell. I'm going to give you, though, a couple of honorable mentions in case you didn't hear about it. So former President Donald Trump is mentioned in these documents, and we knew that Trump had had a previous relationship with Epstein, but the two apparently had a falling out. He is mentioned briefly, as I said. So when Ms. Schoberg says that she was on Epstein's jet, at one point they were diverted to New Jersey because of bad weather, and she claims Epstein said, quote, great, we'll call up Trump and we'll go to the casino. Now, Schoberg also testified in the documents that she was never asked to give Donald Trump a massage. Interestingly, though, Giuffre had testified that when she was 17, she worked as a spa attendant at Trump's Mar-a-Lago in Florida, but was then lured away to become a masseuse for Jeffrey Epstein. Also, honorable mention, Stephen Hawking, the acclaimed physicist. A little bit of a weird one here. So an email from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell in 2015, after Giuffre had filed the lawsuit, said Maxwell could, quote, issue a reward to any of Giuffre's associates who come forward and prove her allegations are false, including that Hawking partook in an underage orgy. Again, no idea what that means, but apparently this was an allegation? I don't know. By the way, Stephen Hawking died in 2018. All right, so we will obviously continue to follow this as more documents are unsealed and more details regarding big names are potentially revealed. Thanks so much for joining us here on Sidebar, everybody. We always very much appreciate it. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.